Thank you very much for all those interesting statements. It's your chance now to ask questions, so if you would like to stand up or sit down, ask the question. If you could please say what your name is, and if you've got an obvious affiliation, that would be helpful too. Yes, sir.
Good evening. My name's Ruskin from United London Eastern Engineering and Manufacturing Centre. Oh, thank you. Check one. My name's Ozzy. I'm from United's London Eastern Engineering and Manufacturing Centre. I've got a question. I'm going to ask it to all the panellists, obviously. But first of all, to Councillor Rod Cantrell. I was with you 9 years ago, the 21st of October in 2010. Guess what you were doing? You were voting to sell off all council housing maintenance workers in Cambridge to a private company. How can you stand there and say you're going to invest in every home by 2030 when you've already sold off the workforce? And can I ask all the panellists what they do to ensure you get 1 million green new jobs? Thank you very much.
I think that's most specifically
Yes. I remember you were there.
aimed at you on the first point.
Thank you for the question. What I would say is that actually, if you look at some of the actions taken by the City Council, you can look at a whole range of things. The first externalisation step in terms of externalisation step. This was the first externalisation step was under a Labour-controlled council when they privatised the leisure services. So, but I think there's an important point that you do come to actually, because as I sat in housing scrutiny, I'm the shadow housing spoke on the City Council. It's a Labour-controlled City Council. They're going to spend 100 million on new gas boilers on our housing stock. Our council housing stock, 100 million. There is no attempt to actually basically put in insulation in our own housing stock. 100 million. You just go and look at the financial plan, the 5-year financial plan. And so one of the points I would make here, people talk, warm words are good, but you need action. Now, I'm sure you will say, well, where's my track record on action? I'm sure that's your next question. Well, there are two major developments in this city, one in the southern fringe and one called Marmalade Lane. They're both passive housing, high sustainable, Code 5. I initiated them as the executive councillor. I insisted that we set the bar high. And interestingly, the development on the southern fringe had 50% affordable, even when the local plan only said 40%. And that was 8-9 years ago when we initiated that action. And the reason I did it was that in a city like Cambridge, the council needs to be the beacon, to set that bar high for all the other developers, to make sure that we are able to say to them, you need to meet that bar. And that's why it's critical that we actually set that bar high for the city to be the greenest city in the UK and have that aspiration.
Was your wider point that you wanted more detail on how a Green New Deal would work from all the candidates? Peter?
I find it incredibly difficult to answer it. Because when I look at what's needed, it's a complete change in how we live. And that retrofitting insulation and going to electric cars just doesn't cut it. The solution, such as it is in your hands. And I actually think that a lot of the money that they're talking about spending is just wasted money because it is maintaining where we already are, which is unsustainable.
Thank you for the question, Ozzy. I mean, just a couple of basic points. Under the last Labour government, there was a £20 billion Decent Homes programme, which absolutely transformed the housing stock right across the country. And people have forgotten just how lousy a lot of our housing was by '97. And we saw new kitchens, we saw new bathrooms, and we saw insulation repairs across this city. And I'm incredibly proud of the fact that that was done. But there were things that were done in the Labour period which weren't right. And Rod is right to say that there was some outsourcing, some privatisation that started then. And I think we've learned the lessons, frankly. I think we've seen where it leads. And when I worked for Unison for a lot of that period and was fighting a lot of those things, a lot of the stock transfers and so on. But what I'm delighted about now is that Labour's position is very, very clear. We want to bring those people back in-house into councils. It gives the capacity to do all those things that we want to do. The reason it doesn't work, the private system, is because the aim is always to produce profit. It's been run by the council. The aim is to produce the common good. It's a completely different thing you're trying to achieve. So I would also just say on the installation of our homes, the tragedy is that when the coalition was established in 2010, they absolutely abandoned the very, very high building standards that Labour had set. Now actually, fortunately I've got the figures with me, 43,431 homes across the east of England that could have been built to high standards, but because they slashed the regulation, they're not. And we have inherited that mess, but the really good news is we have the plan. It's not going to cost people up front by taking the energy companies back under our control where they belong, because we built that infrastructure in the first place. Be clear about that. We're only taking back what's ours. I think I'm being told to wind up, but I feel passionate about it. But we can do that with no upfront cost to ordinary people, and that's what's really important to me.
You ask how a Green New Deal could create 100 million new jobs. Things such as expanding capacity for wind power creates literally hundreds of times more jobs than building new nuclear power stations. As far as privatisation goes, the sheer effort that is going to be required to transform our economy is clearly not something that we can leave to the private sector. The size of effort that is required is of the order of the effort that it took to win the last World War. Several Tory politicians are in the habit of talking nostalgically about the Second World War as if they were there. But it is effort of that size, and nobody would have thought of running D-Day as a privatised operation.
Yes, the woman with the green stripe, please. Oops.
Hi, Claire Gishard, Labour Party. I'd just like to take issue with Rob Cantrell about his 50% affordable housing in South Cambs. We're not impressed by affordable housing. We don't want affordable housing. We want social housing at social rents that ordinary working people can afford.
I couldn't agree more, but when that scheme was started, it was a Labour government and we couldn't build council houses. So we had to build affordable housing. We chose a higher level than the local plan. And I welcome the fact that we're building 500 council houses, but it's unfortunate that we're building them with a commercial property developer who's taking a 17.5% profit.
That's because you've got rid of
It's 70, well, if you look at Norwich are able to deliver that social housing under council control without the need for a commercial property developer. And we need to build more. I've been arguing in the council that we need to start plans now for an additional 1,000 council houses. We have 2,500 people on the housing register. And that's before you think of all those key workers. Those key workers who need to live in the city, otherwise they'll vote with their feet. And actually those key workers, what I proposed is a local living rent at 1/3 of their salary, not at a market rent minus a discount. And what I'm arguing is that should be included in the definition of affordable, so that those people who are the glue of our city actually are able to stay in our city.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. A large part of the housing problem has arisen because people over the last 4 or 5 decades have been buying their houses as a speculative investment. We need to get back to a situation where people have a variety of choices about where they live and pay not some notional value for the gazillions of pounds that their house may be worth in a few decades' time, but what it is actually worth in terms of a place to live. So we need to take the heat out of the housing market. And the Green proposal is that we introduce a tax on land value, which can be, the level of which can be adjusted to do precisely that.
Remind everyone we're here to talk about the environment rather than housing or austerity, or primarily, is this about the environment?
It's loosely related. Well, I've got to be able to respond to the challenge.
1 minute directly related.
Okay. Look, let me just say, very good news for you, Rod. It's going to be the biggest council housing building programme on record if Labour wins his election. So it's quite clear what you've got to do. Vote Labour.
In the middle there, please.
Yeah, I'm probably paraphrasing wildly, but I think it was George Monbiot who suggested that it wasn't just our individual efforts that were going to sort of change things. It was changing what global corporations do, changing their practices. So I would like to know what the, as obviously as a British MP, but obviously as a part of something bigger, hopefully. How would you encourage the businesses in the country and the businesses further afield to get their stack sorted out?
Okay, well, can we have very quick answers, please, from everybody?
I believe that businesses are excellent at adapting. What you have to do is change the environment they're in. We have a limited amount of fossil fuel that we can burn for the next couple of decades. I believe that should be rationed. I believe it should be rationed at source and rationed at consumption. And this is where I believe you, Extinction Rebellion, could actually change the world here and now. If Extinction Rebellion announces that from the 1st of January 2020, everyone will have a carbon ration, and when you've used it up, that's all you get. And we'll be implementing this law sometime in the future, but we'll backdate it to the 1st of January 2020.
Okay.
That will make you think whether you're going to go on holiday to Disneyland next week. And that's a way you can change the world now. That's what superheroes do.
The question was about corporate power and how to restrain corporate power.
So, in my view, we live in a world where there are large power blocks. So you have the US, you have China, and it's so critical that we're part of a power block that actually can defend those values that we're talking about this evening. And the only power block that we have where we're able to do that is the EU. It's very simple. It's only the EU that can stand up to those large international corporations to deliver those types of changes that we have been talking about this evening. And you already see that in terms of some of the European legislation that's been put through. And so for me, in order to address that question specifically, staying in the EU achieves that goal. Let me give you an illustration, for example. If we step out of the EU, 75% of all building materials that are used in the UK actually come from Europe. That includes insulation. That includes many of the sustainable products that are used in high-end sustainable buildings. So there will be a tariff on that, there will be a cost. Staying in the EU enables you to avoid that, enables you to be part of a larger unit in order to make sure that those global corporations move in the right direction and take action now.
Thanks.
Really good question. I think it's a pretty profound philosophical point about how one views the relationship between governments and the state and the markets. And the simple answer is you regulate much more powerfully and effectively. Business, in my experience, is actually pretty good at responding to rules and challenges. If you don't set the right framework, you're not going to get the outcome you want. So, for instance, just going back to that housing, when we set very high environmental standards, what happens? The house builders respond. When you take them away, they don't do it because they don't have to. So it's all about the regulatory frameworks you set. And frankly, over the last decade, we've seen the regulatory requirements falling, and what Labour government will do is it will raise them. But also, what Labour's promising is what we call a mission-oriented industrial strategy, where basically we set the overall goals. And the goals for Labour, tackling climate change, is what the economy is going to be designed to do. It's a completely different way of seeing the economy. That's why it's transformational. It will create loads of jobs, going back to Ozzy's point. Probably a fairer distribution of the wealth that comes from those jobs, because we're socialists and that's what we want to do. But it will actually tackle the climate emergency in a way that left the market, it will absolutely will not happen.
To get corporate giants to pay their fair share, and I think one of the priorities has to be to end the secrecy of offshore jurisdictions and to harmonise tax rates so that companies can't shift their profits so that they pay the smallest amount of tax, which basically means not contributing to the common good. And the only way you can do that is by international agreement, and it is true the EU is key to that.
A lot of hands going up. I'm just going to ask one of the questions that was sent in to me, because I think it's a different kind of question, and that it's how can we move from fossil fuels to renewable power without causing the kind of misery and poverty seen when the coal mines were closed in the 1980s by Margaret Thatcher. And that's the just transition. And actually what we're talking about here and saying whether it's a carbon tax, we've got to close down the North Sea at some stage. That is the reality of our situation. That raises enormous questions about those people who are employed in that industry. And can I just also slightly ask you, Daniel, because I'm aware of the Labour Party view on this, that is there a tension between what the trade union movement wants and needs and what the people of Britain actually want in terms of a just transition? Thank you.
I'll be going last if I may. Sure, and look, let me be completely upfront about this. Of course there's a tension. There's bound to be a tension between the two. But we can resolve that. What we want to make sure is that we're not impoverishing people in our process of moving to a different form of economy. But if it was left to the market, that's exactly what would happen. There's going to be a debate and an argument about how quickly it can be done. Many of us want to go really, really quickly. I quite understand Extinction Rebellion wants to go 2025. The Labour Conference wanted 2030. The Labour Manifesto, almost 2030. Not quite, I would say. But to me, the key point here is the scale of ambition. And frankly, we can spend all evening discussing hypothetical targets. The question is there a party of government that's prepared to take the very, very difficult decisions? Because, to be honest, not everyone in this room is probably of a similar view. But I go around, as all of us do, I suspect, and talk to a lot of people, and we've got a lot of persuading to do. So doing that, I think we do it working with the trade unions in particular. There's going to be a massive reskilling programme. We're promising many, many apprenticeships in the new jobs. It's not easy to say to a highly paid oil worker that you want to move to something else. That's hard, really hard. And the example from the Thatcher period of how not to do it and the damage it's done in the long run is really, really important. But I think it's only going to be done in partnership between working people, their trade union representatives, and a sympathetic government that's going to be prepared to put the resources in to make that transition possible. If it's not a just transition, okay, we might be able to save the planet, but it's also got to be a planet worth living on for people, because otherwise the social divisions will be really, really serious. We've also got automation to deal with. I've heard people lampooning the 32-hour week. Frankly, I remember that's what the bosses said when they were sending kids up chimneys and saying women couldn't have toilet breaks in factories, can't afford it. It's always been said like that. Of course we're going to have to move to a different form of economy. Doing it in a managed way over a decade is a civilised way to do it. And the fact that it's been so ridiculed, I think, tells you all you need to know about the Tories and their approach to this.
I just add that along with a different sort of economy, we'd also be making a different sort of society, because actually the common purpose of reskilling ourselves collectively would give rise to very different sorts of communities and social relationships.
I did have a quick look at the Lib Dem manifesto, and there's a lot on green stuff, and it's really interesting. But there isn't a lot on any just transition. Did I miss it? Or?
No. No, I don't think you missed it. I think if you go to our policy paper, which is about an 80-page policy paper, you'll actually see some very detailed analysis in terms of just transition. And let me start by saying, I know what it's like. I come from a mining community. My dad was a coal miner. He was made redundant in 1984. That community, after the coal mines closed, struggled. The EU set up an enterprise zone, white-collar work came, nobody in the community worked in those offices other than as cleaners, security guards or maintenance. Those people have had that life for most probably about 30 years. Ashfield, where I come from, is ranked 604th of any constituency to send anyone to any university, anyone. And then you wonder why they voted Brexit. That's why they voted Brexit. And I agree completely with Jeremy that what we're doing is we need to... Look, there's an urgency here. We all know that. But we need to make sure that in trying to achieve one goal, we don't create another major problem of that social strife. So whatever transition takes place needs to be thought through in a way that respects those individuals that are employed in those industries. And can I just say, I think there are some really good ideas. For example, the Scottish Government have a transition fund that they're investing in, so that the actual tax coming from North Sea is actually, that they receive, is actually going into this transition fund. And I think that's a really interesting idea. But we need to respect those people's jobs and make sure that that transition happens in an orderly way, because the coal mines are a classic illustration of where it did not.
Thanks very much.
You ready for this one? The tragedy isn't the unemployed, it's the poor beggars that have to go to work every day. If we can reduce the amount of work because we're not consuming, we can spend more time with our family, with our community, we can have a better life. Why are we always worried about the economy and wealth? What I value is my grandchildren and being with them and seeing them. And yes, 32 hours is good, but having a lot more time is great. And if you don't go on holiday and if you don't have high consumer, you can do it. Again.
Money.
Sorry?
With what money? Are you suggesting universal basic income?
No, you're just not spending it. You don't get a new phone every year. You don't go overseas. You stay at home and enjoy your community. It is so much nicer.
What about for those of us who don't have farms?
A colleague of mine at university decided that they would opt out. They had nothing. They just lived in a small house, brought up their kids and grew their own vegetables and saw their kids go all the way through to 18. You can do it. But you've got to change your way of thinking. And you haven't got any choice in that matter.
Okay, thank you.
Russian money.
Yes, I'm going to ask.
Hi there, my name is Mark, I'm from the Cambridge Green Party. It's really exciting to be in an election where we're having these kinds of conversations. We haven't had them in the last two. And we've known about the climate emergency for decades, and people have wanted action for a long time. Our political system has not allowed them, or has not allowed this to happen. It's allowed climate inertia to reign. So my question to all four candidates who are here with us today is, what will you do to change that political system that has stifled progress? Thank you.
The short answer is we need to change it at almost every level. We need to get a more proportional voting system.
Yes.
One of the downsides of the system that we have at the moment is that the two large parties both think they can get a majority. That puts them in the driving seat, gives them the power. Even the layout of the House of Commons encourages adversarial thinking, and actually the climate emergency, more than anything else, requires cooperation. One of the things that I think we are slowly waking up to is the change to political debate and discourse that the climate emergency is bringing. And that is one of the things that actually an adversarial system, as we currently have it, is clearly not going to be the answer. But we need to go beyond that in terms of the system, because the third demand of Extinction Rebellion is about citizens' assemblies, something that's recently been started here in Cambridge. We need to start exploring new ways of establishing consensus and political legitimacy beyond just voting. But we need urgently to change the way we vote and then move on to that.
I agree with quite a lot of that. I just say, in Cambridge's defence, we actually had a brilliant environmental hustings in this very room in 2017 as well. So Cambridge does stay involved in these issues. But I think I'm a constitutional reformer. I would go for proportional representation, I always have done. But I just caution, I don't think it's a silver bullet to solve all the problems. And the reason I think that is because I'm a consensual politician. I'd always try and work with others. But what I do recognise is our society is riven with some really big power imbalances. So don't underestimate the fact that our system, to some extent, does reflect the power in the society. Not everyone wants the same things as we want. And I'm afraid, you know, a lot of the Conservatives, they will talk a nice talk, and all the rest of it. Michael Gove, when he met some people, young people, to meet him, it was all very silver-tongued and all the rest of it. But actually, what the Conservatives want to do is what they always want to do, which is maintain their power and wealth. Now, that's not going to be solved by having a consensual discussion. It's going to be solved, actually, by actually challenging them and beating them. And that's what Labour has always been about. It's the same as a conflict if you're in a trade union with an employer. It would be lovely to think that everyone's interests are always exactly the same. They're not. There are power imbalances, and that's what we've got to challenge. And that's why I'm so thrilled that we've got a Labour Party led by Jeremy Corbyn and John McDonnell, who are really prepared to challenge the established order.
We could be much further forward if you were prepared to work with other parties. And because the Labour Party refuses to work with other parties, we're not making the progress that we need to make in terms of getting rid of the Tories.
It's not about refusing to work with other parties. What I'm saying is there are power imbalances in this society. It'd be interesting to see if we get close to a Labour government coming in, whether our wonderful British democratic system will really allow an irreversible shift of wealth and power in favour of working people. We'll see. Let's see how strong it is. But my guess is that there will be an awful lot done to make sure that never happens. This is a really challenging point. We may well need to change our electoral system at some point, because it's clearly out of date. But what it will mean is that coalitions are made at different points in the process. So all I'm saying is, it's not the only answer. It could be part of the answer, but it's not the whole answer.
To be clear, I did say political reform, not just electoral reform.
Fair point.
So I think it's a really good question in the context of climate change. But before I do, I just want to address this woman at the front, because actually some parties have tried to cooperate, have tried to reach out. I mean, in this election, well, people can laugh, but people can laugh. But actually, there are two parties on this platform who have reached out and created an alliance, because they recognise that, as I said, this is a once-in-a-lifetime issue that we face. And actually, you know, if they end up with a Tory majority, we will have a hard Brexit. So we have reached out. Just coming back to the original question, if I may, though, I think it's so fundamental for delivering that real change in relation to the climate crisis that we reform the political system, the way in which elections happen, not just on a national basis. I'm a big supporter of PR, I'm a big supporter of giving the vote to 16-year-olds, but actually devolving power down to local authorities. Now, unfortunately in Cambridge, and actually, to be fair, I also participated, so did Peter, in an environment, Hustings, during the mayoral election in 2017 in this building as well. So Cambridge is a bit of an outlier when it comes to Hustings on the environment. But we need to make sure that that power is devolved on a democratic basis, because actually the current structure that we have in terms of delivering for this city and the region is not fit for purpose. Not fit for purpose at all. But actually, we need it to be fit to purpose in order to deliver that substantial change on transport, on housing, and on delivering all those things, all those values that we've talked about this evening. And we will only do that if we get proper reform in Parliament.
Thanks very much, Rob. Can I just ask you a question while you were talking about alliances? There were some comments the other day from Ed Davey, the Lib Dem, suggesting that an alliance with the Conservative Party was possible under certain circumstances.
I don't think an alliance with the Conservative Party is possible in any circumstances. Just look at the facts. Just look at the facts.
Please.
If you just look at the facts, there are only two parties on this platform who have remain since the referendum, who will remain when it was very unfashionable in the 2017 election. Actually, when other parties' manifestos said, let's just get on with it, let's just get on with Brexit, let's get it done. So there is no way we're going to jump into bed with a Tory government. Because the simple reason is that Brexit is too important. Brexit is too important. So, and the reality is that we need to work together with other parties. As I've said, we have reached out and worked with a number of parties, the SNP, Green and Plaid. With Green and Plaid, we've created an alliance in this particular election where we've stood down in certain seats, they've stood down in certain seats, because we want to maximise the Remain vote. But the reality is the other parties, particularly Labour, have not engaged. That is the reality.
Well, sorry, Peter, I'm just going to a very, very quick response to the Labour Party not engaging.
Look, I have to respond to that. There's been, as you know, Rod, there are different views within the Labour Party in this, and some of us are very, very Remain indeed. And we were on the same platform on many occasions. But the tragedy for me is that for 2.5 years we worked together in Parliament, cross-party, and we kept that alliance together all the way through to about a month ago, when we were very close to having the numbers for a people's vote. We had 21 Tory rebels who were there. What happened was, Joe Swinson and the SNP pushed for an early election. They let Johnson off the hook.
Shame.
And that's absolutely key. Absolutely key.
You skipped the bit where 19 Labour MPs voted for the Tory Brexit deal.
Absolutely. Of course there have been divisions in the Labour Party. No one's disputing that at all. But if you write off half the country, which is what Lib Dems have done, there's no prospect of winners. The only way we get to Remain now is through the people's vote. And what I'm delighted about is that Jeremy Corbyn is absolutely committed to that people's vote. There is only one path to Remain in this country. That is through that people's vote. And I've always believed we will remain in the European Union, and I think we will, providing Labour wins this election.
I think it comes down to a very clear set of facts in terms of what Labour's position is. I agree there are a lot of people like Daniel who are passionate Remainers, but the leadership is not Remain. And interestingly, I was talking on the doorstep to a Labour member the other night, and what they were saying is, they reminded me of the Labour conference, where there were two motions put to the conference. One motion was, this party will be the party of Remain. That fell. That fell. The second one was the current position that the Labour Party have, and that passed, even though there were some issues as to whether it really did pass or it didn't. Okay. And so that is the issue. There is no clarity from Labour in terms of the guarantee of delivering that second referendum.
Absolute clarity. Absolute clarity.
I think this is an excellent example about how politics isn't working today.
Yeah.
The point I want to make is that every engineer will know a governor and a regulator are there to maintain the status quo. I have a history of being a disruptor. Disruptor in telecom, disruptor in the financial services. Go to my website, door.co.uk, and see. It is unbelievable, but it's true what I've achieved in my life so far. You go and have a look. I want to disrupt what's going on in all levels of government, because the sea change that we need of people who go and do stuff rather than argue or talk about it. What has happened with politics at the moment, in my view, is they've made the perfect the enemy of the good. We've actually just got to get on and do stuff. We will break things in the process, but it's got to be done now, it's got to be done fast. And these people just can't do it. You need a superhero.
Okay. We've seen enough of disruptors. I mean, we've seen what big tech has done. It started with money and it ended up by undermining democracy. So I'm not sure about the entrepreneurial breakers of
So
the status
the
quo.
internet was a disaster, was it?
Yes. The internet is an extraordinary creature until it was colonised by corporations. This lady here has been trying to... Yes, please can we ask about an environmental question?
Do I just speak? Okay. Someone, a wit has said recently that some people would rather see the end of the world than the end of capitalism. And capitalism is the elephant in the room, because the whole problem, as far as the fossil fuel industry, as far as the corporations that are really outside the control of governments, is completely, indifferent to what what we really care about. And I'm particularly concerned in this regard when the Lib Dem prospective candidate runs a company with one of its clients is BP. Now, I personally inspires me with any sort of feeling of confidence in his credibility in addressing the climate emergency. Because what we've got to be doing is keeping fossil fuels in the ground, and nobody yet is really saying in terms of this discussion
I think Rob needs to answer that specific question about VP, and all the candidates need to ask a specific question about whether it's possible to actually produce effective global climate action with a capitalist system.
Thanks. So, as I said, my dad was a coal miner, and coal miners, their argument is you call a shovel. So you should be open and you should be honest with people. So these are the facts. The facts are some 15 years ago, I worked as an advisory team which involved BP. There were a number of businesses, non-oil related, one of which was parts for solar panels, and that was the project. Haven't worked for BP since. BP has not provided any cash to my campaign, and those are the facts.
Ineos?
And the same goes for those other companies that you referenced in various social media. I just want to bring a point here, because I know that the Labour leaflet included this reference, and I think it's a real shame, because if people need to turn to this style of negative politics in order to win, if people need to turn to this negative politics in order to win elections, then that's fine. I'm going to run an election on positive politics, putting forward positive.
Look at your own leaflet.
Putting forward.
Sorry. Please let the candidate speak.
Yes.
Putting forward positive policies, and just in relation to whether you believe me or not, actually Michael Crick was contacted. Just follow his social media and see what his views are when he was shared the facts. Because what Michael Crick said was actually these are desperate tactics being used in order to win an election. So they're not my words, they're Michael Crick's. Just go to his social media.
Okay, can we answer the point about whether it's possible to take effective climate action with a capitalist system?
No. And when I made that point a few minutes ago, I was divided. Thank you, lady. You can't. The ark that I'm building in Norfolk is. You can say I'm scared. It isn't a consumer society. It's a self-sufficient society, and it's a circular society.
Excuse me.
Well, the answer is I'll have room for 1,000. But
please let the candidate.
But you are welcome to copy what I'm doing and make your own, because that's your best bet for the future. If you ask me.
Excuse me. Thank you.
You can find land. You can find landowners who've got similar issues to what I have.
Excuse me.
Yes.
Capitalism.
I think very difficult is the answer. Very, very difficult. But it's a very powerful system. It's pretty all-pervasive at the moment. And actually, if we're going to tackle this crisis with the urgency it requires, it may be that we're going to have to try and use some of that system to work with us to make it happen. Which goes back to my earlier point about having the right regulatory frameworks and actually incentivising some of those parts of business to actually do the things that help rather than don't help. So it's actually a choice for government. And at the moment, the current government chooses not to use those levers, whereas very clearly an incoming Labour government will choose. Now, whether that involves the overthrow of capitalism, I think it's, that's quite an ambition, frankly, for some of us. But I think in reality, it's much more likely we're going to have to work with it. But you've absolutely got to set the right frameworks, the right goals. And if you do that, we may just be able to turn this round in time. And that's, I think, probably what you want to get back to, Chair, this key issue of how we're going to do this in the right time frame. And we've had a lot of committees. I actually look back to the 2010 Climate Change Act. I'm proud of that. We had cross-party consensus on that in those days. The setting up of the carbon budgets and so on, it does get quite technical. Sometimes it leaves people a bit cold. But it's about that just transition, because I'm not prepared to go to the people that I represent in this city and tell them they're going to have to lead a pretty difficult life, as Peter's suggesting, for their future. I want to be able to provide them with a decent future, but one where the planet survives. That's the challenge. And I think we can do it, but it's going to mean taking on some pretty powerful vested interests. And that's why I think the Labour Party is in a good position to do that. But it won't be easy, because they want to carry on making their profits.
Thank you. I think you've put your finger on the central issue here. The capitalist system as we have it at the moment isn't succeeding even in its own terms. For myself, it was actually thinking about the 2009 crisis that led me into green politics, because it led me to realise that you cannot continue operating a system that depends on perpetual growth on a finite planet. So, if we are going to reform it or change it, we are inevitably going to change it into something that is unrecognisably different. As far as oil companies go, I think that they are a significant part of the issue, because they're a significant part of the capitalist system as we have it at the moment. And as Daniel has mentioned, one of the things that I've been doing is campaigning for Cambridge University to publicly announce that it'll divest from fossil fuels. We need to be absolutely clear that fossil fuel companies have to stop doing what they are doing. They have known since 1965 what the effect of their products have been. In that time, they have spent literally billions trying to cast doubt on campaigners and to lobby governments. The thought that now engaging with them is the answer, it clearly isn't. We simply need to put them out of business.
Okay, there's a forest of hands, and that gentleman with the grey hair has been trying very hard to catch my eye, and has this gentleman here and that gentleman there. Before I do go to those floor questions, though, I've been sent a number of questions about one particular issue, and that's not just about transition to justice of a green industrialisation. It's about our relationship with foreign countries, and this was the question which encapsulates that. What measures would you support to repay the climate debt we owe to countries who were first impoverished by colonialism and then had their suffering compounded by primarily rich countries destroying their climate? That's about global justice rather than UK justice. Can we go straight through as quickly as possible, please? Quick comment.
I can't say I can see a solution. Basically, when you're looking at an Extinction Rebellion scenario, the people who die first are the poor. And I just do not honestly see any solution for that. To a certain extent, we've actually just got to sit here and be really quite smug that we live in a rich country and we're relatively rich. Because you're not going to change. Because you're not going to give up on consumerism. You're not going to go around in whatever. You're not going to do it. I'm sorry. That, there's only so much resource on the planet, and
you want them all.
I'm going to say I have a modest life, relatively speaking, but I don't fly. I grow my own food. I've got electric car. They're quite old. I have a modest life. I could fly around the world in my, I don't. But it's you that's got to do it. And if you do it, then we can feed more people. But while you carry on living the good life, party while you can, because as my Twitter handle says, party like there's no tomorrow. Of course there isn't.
Not too honest!
Well, I think it's a really interesting question, because I think already you are seeing in other areas, such as the slave trade and so forth, where actually the colonial actions of previous generations are now starting to actually, we're starting to address those. And the slave trade is a good illustration, and there are some work going on here in Cambridge, particularly in the university and some of the colleges, in terms of understanding whether or not there should be compensation that could be paid back to those countries where there was slave trade. And I think that's an interesting model about how you actually achieve that on a international basis, because it's not just the UK that was a colonial power. There are a lot of first world countries, many of them European, who were colonial powers where this happened. I'm not sure, but I do think it's a route, because actually some of the environmental damage that's been caused to those countries in far distances across the world has been material over generations. So I think it's something that does need to be addressed.
I'd agree with much of that. I mean, this is why we have an international architecture for dealing with these issues, the Paris Agreement and so on. We were trying to balance up some of those issues. And the tragedy, of course, is with, well, Trump is a tragedy in many ways. It is really difficult when you've got one of the major powers like that as withdrawing from that international dialogue. I think the only answer to it is international dialogue, and with the countries that industrialised first recognising their responsibilities. And I think we should do that. And I have to say, this is an election. I think if you ask yourself whether Mr. Johnson or Mr. Corbyn, which of them is more likely to face up their international responsibilities and recognise their global responsibilities, I don't think you need me to tell you the answer to that question. We will, and the Tories won't. So if that's what you want, and it's certainly what I would like to see, a much more just global world. And of course, part of, if you come down to self-interest, if we see the kind of rise in sea levels that are predicted very quickly, then we will begin to see mass movements of people that will have a very, very direct effect on our country. So it's actually not just an ethical issue, it's a self-interested issue too. But personally, I would like to make an appeal to the British people to say, look, we've benefited from a lot of the things that happened in the past. We've got a responsibility here, and I think we should absolutely be facing up to that.
Come back and ask one additional question. Do you think that it's fair that emissions should be able to rise in countries like China that haven't had our traditional wealth while they're falling heavily in the UK?
Well, China's a big issue, isn't it? And of course they've seen themselves, the pollution that they're suffering, the issues that they're facing very directly. They actually are making more progress in some cases than some other countries. So let's not be casting blame around the world. I think they're more ready to engage than the Americans at the moment, quite frankly, because they can see the potential dangers ahead. But it's absolutely true to say that whatever we do, if we can't persuade others to come with us, then it's going to be very, very difficult indeed. We've got to work with China, and I think we did have an architecture, but as I say, with Trump and America, we've just got to hope that some of the Americans see sense, as I hope we're going to see in this country, and that the awful year of 2016 is replaced by a great year in 2019, 2020, and by next Christmas we've got a more civilised world.
I agree with much of what has been said. As far as China goes, of course, a lot of the emissions in China are produced making the things that we buy here. And I noticed that people who generally don't want to do anything about the climate emergency will often try to use China as a way of throwing the debate off course. I would just make one further observation, that this is different in a significant way from the slavery debate, which is significant in itself, in that we need all countries to work together to reduce our emissions, and so that's a further way in which, so we need the cooperation of countries that we have previously exploited. That is another way in which the climate emergency changes the nature of political debate.
Thanks very much. Yeah. I wasn't actually suggesting that China was the culprit and should be blamed, rather the reverse, that emissions in the West should be reduced, and it was appropriate for social justice reasons that emissions rose in the global South. I've got to stick with what I said earlier, which was that gentleman who tried so hard. Yes, you're standing up now, please.
Hello, my name is Phil Ward. I suppose I'm a passive-aggressive Labour Party member. I live off Eastern Road. I walk to the shops, carry everything in bags, etc. The free I have around here, Aldi, Iceland, Co-op. Unless I can buy fruit and veg that's not packaged, everything is in packages, and it's amazing when you look at the cellophane that keeps it fresh, how much is not actually recyclable. Now, building houses, going over green, all the targets are great in the long term, but rather like stopping plastic bags. We could change this tomorrow. We could actually be half or a quarter of what goes in the blue bins. We're next to no effort. And we're just not targeting the supermarkets like that. We're not giving farmers breaks with markets where they can actually. The markets are reducing. There's very few. If we could buy fresh British, it would cut down a lot of carbon emissions. And from the point of view of bringing Brexit into it and making it this thing about everything being easy to travel across borders, perhaps if we did things in our own country, we wouldn't need to have things brought, because there's carbon footprints there. You know, the thing about we rely on the EU with cars or manufacturing, and a car goes across the channel 20 times or something, it shouldn't move when you're making it. I think Brexit's irrelevant. You know, we need to do more, and we can change these easy. These are little things, but these can be done with a sweep of a pen. They can be done within the next 6 months. Actually cutting down on packaging and giving breaks for farmers to sell fresh food and things on stalls, and actually give us back some, get us back to small shops on the high street. Reduce the rates on them.
Thank you very much indeed. Very good question. I'm going to try and speed things up because I'm aware that sort of time is beginning to pass. I'm going to take 3 questions at a time at the moment. That gentleman and then that gentleman who've been waiting so long. Yes, you. Yes, you.
Ian Wolves, Cambridge Friends of the Earth. It's directed at Rob Cantrell again. Just to get back to your working for BP, I have no issue with you working 15 years ago for BP. 30 years ago I used to work at Heathrow Airport. So until I saw the light, or in my case, the green and purple sunsets and the pollution. What I would be more concerned about is, does your company currently have clients in the fossil fuel industry, and are they likely to have them in the future? I think that's possibly a much more appropriate question.
Okay, that's another question.
Okay, my name's David Carter. My question is similar, actually. So I just want people to know these other companies that Rod's business has had as clients. Somebody's mentioned Ineos, the fracking company.
Fracking.
There's also OMV, who are an oil and gas company who have been under investigation for involvement in war crimes in Sudan. And the Carlyle Group, I haven't been in the news much in recent years, but they profited massively from the events around 9/11 and the Iraq wars. And I'd just like to ask Rod, I mean, it seems to me having one client like BP could be a misfortune, and I take your word for it, it was solar power, but having 4 seems like carelessness at best.
So, just trying to, we had a conversation on the doorstep on Saturday, and I wrote you a letter on Sunday.
I haven't seen it, I'm afraid.
I posted it to you.
I didn't.
Well, I posted you a letter to give a fuller reply.
Sorry, I didn't.
So, all those companies we did projects for in the, did assignments for in the early 2000s. And in many ways, our business, the work I do now, is reflective of what's happening in terms of lots of sectors of the economy moving towards green technologies. So, for example, in the last 5 years, we focused on wind, So companies that manufacture the cores for wind turbine blades, tidal energy, a major player in the tidal energy market, and companies which are focused on sustainable technologies. So none of those companies we've worked for over 15 years. None of them at all. And it's interesting that, you know, that evidence has been provided to a number of news outlets over the course of the last couple of weeks because of some of the social media activity. But I'm glad this evening that I've been able to set the record straight, because actually focusing on things that happened 15 years does make this point in terms of we're all on a journey. Look, I admit that, you know, I'm still on this journey. I've still got a long way to go. I'm sure everybody on this panel, you know, you could ask people on this panel, have they accepted hospitality from a major fossil fuel company over the course of the last 2 years?
That's a bit different.
Well, have they accepted hospitality? And the answer most probably is yes. But I'm not going to put that in leaflets. I mean, how can that...
Put these companies on your website.
So look, I mean, you know, the reality is, and I will come back to your question, but I'm trying to answer this one first. The reality is that those companies we worked for over a decade ago, some 15 years ago, the answer to the question in terms of working for fossil fuel companies now, the answer is no. We don't work for fossil fuel companies. We have no intention of working for fossil fuel companies going forward. And actually the reality is that my activities, my company and so forth, evolves as sectors evolve in terms of focusing on sustainable outcomes for industries like wind, like tidal, like solar. It's as simple as that.
Okay, thank you. Listen, the original question was about plastics.
Can I just answer the plastics question as well?
Very quickly.
We might not be here, because since and it's good to clear up that misunderstanding which seems to be being put out across various social media. So, just coming back to the original gentleman on plastics, it's a very valid point. And actually, there was a simple measure that the Liberal Democrats introduced in the coalition government that had a dramatic effect. I'll just wait, because it's not really polite, so I'll just wait. So it's a very simple measure. We charged for plastic carrier bags in supermarkets. The impact was dramatic overnight. That actually the use of single-use carrier bags fell materially. So it is evidence that actually you can make substantial change. So
please don't.
You can make substantial change in relation to. Well, you can make substantial change in relation to single-use plastics, and actually we need to go further. We need to stop the exporting of plastic waste, because that actually in itself is a crime. We're exporting our plastic waste to other parts of the world, which is disgraceful. And then the final thing...
You might be, but I'm not.
The reality is if you are recycling in the blue bins, there is no guarantee that that blue bin waste is treated here in the UK. No guarantee. No guarantee at all. And just the final point, if I may, I think we should go further, because actually continental Europe, I think the Germans and the Scandinavians provide excellent examples of how you can tackle these issues around consumer use. So in Germany, you have a deposit scheme for bottles in terms of returning them, which works very effectively, and actually that's something that one should think about here in the UK.
Thank you very much.
I feel I've got to admit to the companies that I've been associated with over the last 20 years, the Internet Watch, who is mitigating some of the damage that abuse of the internet does. Sunflowers, which is a hospice for children in Cottenham. The Jubilee Project, the homeless place underneath Cambridge. Various Cambridge news and radio things which were done for the community. Peterborough Theatre, which I've just just rescued. If you're worried about people's associations with companies, can we look at the positive ones as well? Because I'm proud of who I've worked with.
Nigel Farage.
Yes. You may be bitterly opposed to Brexit, but you look at what he says and what he does, they're consistent. And show me another politician who, when he thought the job was done, walked away. He walked away after...
He's a racist bigot.
No, he walked away. I'm sorry.
Peter, I think you've moved off plastics.
As far as plastics, I'm going to, as usual, reflect it back to you. How many of you used to use the bins that you collected from Tesco's, and now you buy a roll of them to put into your waste bin? Because I bet a lot of you do.
Thank you. I haven't used one in 40 years.
Good for you.
Daniel.
Plastic recycling, really, really important subject. I led a debate in Parliament a few months ago. One interesting thing was I got together a group of people in Cambridge who were really experts on this. And I'm afraid, like so many other things, it's a bit more complicated than it seems at first sight. And so the balance between keeping food fresh, which means that there's a danger that you waste a lot if you don't have some of the plastic there, it is quite complicated and difficult. You know what, I'm afraid it is absolutely... Well, put it this way. I don't know everything. You'll be delighted to hear. So what I tend to do, and Cambridge is a great place because you can actually go and talk to people who do know quite a lot about things. And what you find is...
A sliced potato in a plastic bag. We can cut our own potatoes.
Yes, well I was going to come on to that point. Because that part of it is quite complicated, although of course there's much more we can do. And I actually totally agree with Rod on the plastic bag issue. I think Labour should have done that years before, so that succeeded. But on the local production, this is really, really important because we've ended up with a very complicated system where, frankly, an awful lot of our food, is arriving just in time, so-called, using that kind of packaging that you're describing. And I think it's a choice, frankly, for us. This may be an economically efficient way of doing things, but is it actually, when you look at the bigger picture, is it really the kind of world we want to live in? And I think we should be going much more local wherever we can. And I think that is the answer. But it will mean some changes, possibly. I mean, I'm not sure we need all the season's vegetables all the year round. I'm old enough to think it was actually quite nice. So that would be a big change. And if you look at the cost of food now in terms of cash terms to 20, 30 years ago, we're spending much less of our budget on it. Actually, maybe we're spending too little. In fact, maybe we should be spending more on that and getting that local system. It's a big change to make, but I keep coming back to this basic point tonight. It is an emergency. We need to get on with it. We need to change things quite dramatically, and that may be the kind of thing that we can look at.
Thank you.
I agree with a lot of that about local networks. Clearly, a lot of the plastic is there to facilitate long journeys that we can do without, and things would change if we rearrange the system. But having small shops, fewer food miles, and so forth is clearly important.
Paper bags.
Paper bags, absolutely. But on the subject of having a deposit for bottles. It's not just something we should think about. The Greens have had it in their manifesto for the last 2 elections. And not only plastic bottles, but I think you said we should be stopping producing plastic bottles. We should. If you have a deposit system, then actually having glass bottles that are reused becomes economically viable again. And that's clearly the route we should go down. I notice, going around canvassing around Cambridge, there are a very high proportion of people who can't vote in this election because they are European citizens. And several of them have said one of the frustrating things about living in the UK is you can't buy water in glass bottles.
Yeah, absolutely.
You might want bubbles.
I'm going to take a question from...
I tend to find the taps.
QED.
Brighton is a green county and they don't recycle plastic in Brighton.
Okay, thank you very much.
Why not?
This is a bit of a disillusioned question, but much in the same way that capitalism has failed us due to the vested corporate interests in short-term profits, my personal opinion is that politics has failed us and failed our planet at both national and international levels because of politicians' vested interest in short-term power. Can you show me a better future than that?
I'm going to take a second question here, yes.
In September, I noticed a lot of trees dying around Cambridge. A lot of them were also sacrificing branches where single branches died off, leaves and so on. Knowing a little bit about hydrogeology, that rang alarm bells because it meant the groundwater had dropped. Because when the groundwater drops, springs dry up, trees die. I did a little bit of investigation and sure enough, chalk streams are dying. The River Cam is basically only maintained through sluice gates. And the tributaries of the Cam are basically being pumped 24/7. You know, without those pumps, they would be dry. Why is this happening? Well, we are using too much water. We're using a lot of water, and not only that, we are building more and more houses in a dry area. So basically, it's all very well talking about, you know, looking after our environment, when we are doing the opposite of that. We are just building more houses and making the problem worse. So what I want to say is, what is your choice? Is your choice housing or rivers? Because that is the choice.
Okay, listen up. Thank you very much indeed for those two questions. Short-termism, usually businesses are blamed for short-termism, looking at quarterly financial results, never looking long-term, but politicians can be blamed for the same thing, four yearly cycles. How do we get around that? And secondly, yes, the Cam, the situation facing the River Cam, trees dying, and that wider growth agenda that is pushed so heavily by certain organisations around Cambridge, is that compatible with decarbonisation? I'm going to move Jeremy through.
Yes, I share a lot of your alarm. Politics has failed us, and I think we need to. That is in part why I talked earlier about moving beyond political systems that are just about voting. When it comes to voting, the Greens' proposal for a second chamber in Parliament is one where people are elected for 10 years, and half of them are elected every 5 years, which gets us away from the 4 to 5 year cycle a bit. But I think your main point remains, and we do have to find other ways, other forms of politics to address this. As far as trees and water, yes, clearly we cannot build more houses if there's no water for them. The fact that our water companies are run for profit is just ridiculous, given the size of the challenge. The Cambridge Water Company, I think, is owned ultimately by HSBC, and oh right, it's been taken over.
No,
it's been
taken over.
Okay, right. One of the issues with all privatised water companies is they have to balance their profit against spending money on things like mending leaking pipes. the Cambridge Water Company, based on the figures in their report, it would seem that for every 3 litres that comes out of your tap, there's 1 litre that has leaked out along the way. I think that's scandalous.
Well, 4-year cycles, you said, Terry. If only. We don't have 4-year cycles at the moment. That's part of the reason why I voted against this election, because I actually believe in the Fixed Term Parliament Act that was introduced by the Coalition, because I don't think Prime Ministers should be able to dictate the terms of Parliaments just to suit their own advantage. But I expect you're thinking about slightly more long term. Look, the reason I do politics is because I'm really proud of a system that allows people here to come and challenge our politicians. There are plenty of countries in the world where people don't have that opportunity. I had some young people from Turkey I went to see a few months ago at the YMCA, and I turned up on my bike, and they looked astonished. I said, "Where's your bodyguard?" And I said, "Well, in Cambridge, our politics, thankfully, I can wander around, go out on my bike and talk to people," and they were absolutely astonished. So I get why people are disillusioned with our politics, but never forget the struggle that people have had in this country, working people in particular, to get a say. And I think we forget that at our peril. But of course, a more long-term approach would be better. On the water issues, yeah, you and I have talked about this. I actually challenged the Environment Minister exactly on this question in the House of Commons a few weeks ago. But you posed the challenge, housing or water. I think we can do much better with our housing, frankly. It is possible to build housing to much higher standards. It almost goes right back, I'm sorry, Chair, to where we started tonight. It's about the rules you set, the regulations you set. I think we can do it, but not under the current system.
Thank you very much.
So, just coming back to politics have failed. I mean, I'm an optimist, and I actually would like to think that actually, that, you know, going forward, we can correct some of the problems we've had in the past. I agree with Jeremy. Electoral reform is fundamental for that, because I think a lot of people feel that they are disenfranchised from the system with first past the post. Yeah. If you look at the 2015 election, 4 million people voted for UKIP, and they got 1 MP, which was kind of the Tory reject guy, Reckless. And I'm not saying that I'm in any way a UKIP sympathiser, but if those people have had representation in Parliament with, say, 10 or 15 UKIP MPs, they could have been held to account publicly. And we may not have necessarily had the outcome that we've had over the course of the last few years. So I think fundamental to this is electoral reform. But I think it's a two-way street. I think the public need to recognise that they do need to be engaged in this debate with politicians. And I think the issue that we're here tonight to talk about is an excellent example where they are engaged in a major way. I think Brexit is another illustration of that, particularly in terms of Remain, the Remain support, where you see 1 million people protesting on the streets of London, marching on the streets of London. So, but I believe that actually going forward, we can build a better world by using, you know, people and politicians working together. Just specifically on the water issue, I was very fortunate. I was part of the councillor panel that heard evidence from various parties a few weeks ago, organised by the executive councillor, the Labour executive councillor, who did a brilliant job of bringing people together. And it's interesting because I had lots of like snapshots of different people's points, but actually what that did is actually brought into one room for a morning all these bits of evidence, and it was so compelling. It was so compelling, and there were 3 observations I would make. One is we need to take action yesterday on this issue. The Environmental Agency and Cambridge Water fundamentally failed this city about 9 months ago. The Environmental Agency decided that they would not press Cambridge Water to basically put in place the emergency step plans relating to a drought. And as a result, we kept pumping the water out of the aquifers. Now, we need 120, 160% rainfall over this winter in order just to get them back to a 60% level. And very worryingly, in July and August, I'm sure those people who were there saw it, they actually got to the point where they were almost exhausted. And if I could just make one more point, actually, it's so fundamental that that action is taken. But there is a long-term issue, and I do tend to agree with Daniel. I think we can deliver housing and sustainable living, but we need to do it on a basis where those houses have the highest level of sustainability, using a lot less water and a lot less energy.
Thank you very much, Peter.
I told you so. 30 years ago, I was on the front page of what was then the Cambridge Evening News saying Cambridge is full and that we should stop the growth. And it was ignored. And at the time, it was said we were going to run out of water. It's not 9 months ago that the failure happened, it was decades ago. And I'm afraid I'm sitting here seeing the same thing happen again. I'm here desperately begging you to look at the long term. And politicians aren't the answer. It's got to be you, and it's got to be people who are disrupting the whole thing. So, no, I can't give you any reassurance about politicians. Their main solution to politics is that you should have more. If the medicine doesn't work, give them more. I'd actually argue we could do with less politicians and more scientists and more engineers who are going to go out there and solve the problem. So the growth that we've had in Cambridge, yes, it has created wealth. It's created wealth for the landowners and the developers. When I look at how much people pay in rent now, most people have actually got a lower disposable income than they had before.
Exactly. So
I go up to Peterborough and I see workers in Peterborough enjoying a better quality of life than those in Cambridge. You might want to move there. Why don't we move some of our businesses there? And these people keep digging. You look at the current plans. The current plans are for twice as many workspaces as homes. Now tell me that's sustainable in a town that has got a deficit, a massive deficit of homes. The only people that benefit from a deficit of homes are landlords, because we can charge more rent. And it's all very well saying we should up the wages. All that will do is allow them to put the rents up. What we need is a balanced economy, the right number of houses, the right number of jobs. Not too many, not too few.
That we would end at 9 o'clock, and I want to.
Could I just answer that one point directly? Because that is I've got one policy. So that's it. So would you mind if I just?
Yeah. Okay.
Who are you?
Mike.
Is it Canada?
He's one of the candidates.
Standing in the election. Because apparently there's not enough seats, I sit up here. My name's Keith Garrett. I'm from Rebooting Democracy. So I stood in the last 2 elections, the third. I'm also part of the Extinction Rebellion. I'm on the Citizens Assembly Working Group. We've seen people here arguing about various things. What we've also recently had is a group of 53 citizens, randomly selected. They sat down together, as you discussed. They listened to the evidence. They made decisions, and they came up with a plan. I've been in Cambridge for, I don't know, about 15 years, maybe longer. It's always been a mess with congestion. These people sat down for 2 weekends, came up with what they should do. There's no lobby groups, there's no people trying to get jobs out at the end of it. It was just people like you and me sitting down, making decisions. And that's the answer to your question. It's what Extinction Rebellion wants, to make a plan for climate change, and it's what we should have to make all our decisions, us making decisions for ourselves. Thanks very much.
Normally we allow like people to sum up with a very quick sort of pithy statement. Rather than actually doing that, I'd rather like each candidate very, very briefly and quickly gives an example of where they didn't just talk about something, they actually did something.
Sitting in the University Council 3 or 4 years ago, I asked a question about when can we talk about our investments. The silence that followed me asking that question is what basically brings me here this evening. I think actually changing the system is something is top of the list of what we need to do. Thank you.
I bought myself an electric bike. I'm an absolute evangelist for it. It's the transformational way. Peter's got a version which looks like a green cigar. I'll stick to my slightly more stylish electric bike. It does get me wet when it rains, but I'm not too bothered about that. But I think when you look at what's happened across Europe, I think in Germany there's sort of 1 million electric bikes last year. What did our country manage? 60,000. Wow, we've got a way to go.
For me, it was a very simple community campaign, which was to save a set of London plane trees on Alexandra Park Gardens in Chesterton. And it just illustrates the point, because I started as executive councillor with the officers telling me I need to chop them down. And 2.5 years later, I reached the conclusion that they should not be chopped down, that they should be saved, that they have an amenity value of over 100,000, this is a calculation, 100,000 per tree to the community. And those trees are still there now. They're still there now. And I think that's an illustration of that actually, you know, it's the small stuff just as much as the big stuff that's very important for our communities and for our environment.
Thank you.
I'd just like you to go to my website and look what I've done. And it was all done without political power and without government money. Resonance is probably the one I'm most proud of, which is a company that raises money for charities and not-for-profits. It has raised over £300 million invested in homeless projects, in autistic schools, in health centres, in community projects, all done with the efforts of other superheroes who work with me. What I've seen in the audience is 3 people who get what I do, and if they'd like to come up and see me, and if there's a couple of others, I would love to be the Xavier, the Patrick Stewart, and endow superpowers on you, because I can do it. I've done it tens of times.
I think the people who've got the superpower are you guys and Extinction Rebellion. Thank you very much indeed for coming.